Hello all. So we're nearing the end of this course, and today I want to cover one of the things that, in a certain sense, is the most foundational issue. And this is the issue of whether or not, in its most basic form, our senses reliably tell us about the world. Whether or not we can say that because I perceive something, it's a real sort of thing. So one way to go about addressing this issue is by discussing primary and secondary qualities. So we already had the book, and it covers this, and Blackburn does a good job of providing a wide array of thinkers in a relatively straightforward fashion. Otherwise, it'd be very difficult to kind of do this literature tree on our own. I'd have to assign numerous different people. Um, So instead, we just rely on Blackburn to kind of convey the central issues to us. So with that in mind, I'll just get directly into it. So this distinction isn't as rigorously defined as it could be straight out of the gate by Blackburn. And part of that is a historical fact. Numerous different people were talking about this sort of idea, but not all of them defined their terms, and not all of them came up with the term primary and secondary quality. Uh, these people, in some cases, came to these ideas entirely separately. So, the general idea, although it's variously defined, is that primary qualities are qualities uh, which produce simple ideas in us. I always have typos, and I don't notice it. So, primary qualities are, yes, properties which produce simple ideas in us, and these sorts of ideas, simple ideas, are basic conceptual features of any object. So simple ideas are non-composite, as the word might imply, and so they're not built up of various other ideas. They're sort of what you would immediately get from an impression, so to speak. So just the most basic fundamental ideas that come along with perceiving any sort of object. And these sorts of things are thought to be independent of the observer, although that's not the best way to define it because that's sort of begging the question. It's already to presuppose that there's an external world, and some people might say that that's the very question that needs to be proven. But I think it's most illustrative to consider the various examples, and I think this is probably, in this case, a better way to understand the concept than to rely on a definition, as strange as that might sound. And the various examples of primary qualities are extension, solidity, number, like the number of objects, location, and motion. So extension is just the idea that an object is, you might just say it's 3D, it's extended in space. It's the sort of thing that can occupy some sort of position in space. Um, Solidity, the notion that this sort of thing occupies a unique space and some other distinct thing can't occupy the exact same space without being that thing or a part of that thing. So each object, insofar as it is an object, has its own independent space that it occupies in 3D. So the extension and solidity are kind of go together. Number, this just means how many there are. So irrespective of the other sorts of properties that we think about a thing, it seems like there is either one of it or two of them or three or so on. And that doesn't really depend on any sort of um, specific sense faculty to have that thought. It just seems to be any sort of object is going to be a single object or multiple objects. Likewise, with location, it just seems that insofar as a thing is occupying space, insofar as it has extension, it's somewhere in that space in particular. And then motion, whether or not it's moving through space, through time. Secondary qualities, on the other hand, uh, are thought to be powers of objects to produce various sensations in us, and I think this definition is more clear. That's less sort of question begging. Um, so the idea is that there are primary qualities, right? And primary qualities are these sorts of like brute physical features of a thing, and these sorts of features, in conjunction with our sense faculties, produce secondary qualities. So I could maybe I'll write that down. This format might get butchered, but so so the primary qualities plus sense faculties equals secondary qualities. So the idea here is that a primary quality or a secondary quality will only emerge as a result of our sense faculty interacting with a certain sort of physical primary quality, I should say. I shouldn't say physical property. So in this case, uh, take the example of maybe you have an idea of a rock or something like that, and it seems like a rock is 3D, it's extended in space, there's only one of them, it's solid as far as we could tell, and then it might have various other features about it. If it's been sitting out in the sun, you pick up a rock that you saw while you're on a hike. Um, this rock might have heat, right? It might feel warm, and that feeling of warmness isn't something just in the rock by itself. That feeling of warmness is only the conjunction of some physical properties, the molecules in motion that are occurring in that rock, along with your sense faculties, your sense of feel or whatever's going on there. Likewise with color, you might think that so the rock has some sort of physical makeup, it has some surface texture that bounces light off of it in a certain way, and that bouncing of light hits our eye, the complicated apparatus, and then we perceive a brown color or something like that. But of course, that brownish color wouldn't exist if there were no sense faculty involved in the picture. If it were just a primary quality alone, there would just be a certain sort of extension of the object, in a certain specific way. It would have the same sort of contours or whatever, but it wouldn't be any particular color apart from someone that can perceive colors. And similarly, you might think the same about weightiness, for example. So while an object might be extended in space or something like that, the fact that something seems heavy to us, that it's hard to lift or easy to lift, that clearly is a case of something that depends on our sense faculties. So that's the broad distinction that's in play here. And the claim is generally that secondary qualities aren't fully real objective things, and primary qualities are fully real things. So the issue is whether or not that claim can be maintained reasonably. So one of the first people to sort of propound this distinction is Galileo. And I've already been hinting at this sort of argument that seems to be going on, but I lay it out more clearly here. So in a way, this is a sort of conceptual argument. You might think it's independent of experience, it's a priori, as we've learned. Um, so the idea is that it seems like in considering any sort of object, just by the very nature of what it means to be an object, we're thinking of a thing that is bound, right? It has like a discrete amount of volume it takes up. If it's one object, it's connected in a certain sort of way. It has extension, right? So part of being bound is that it's occupying that's a unique space, and it's the only thing occupying that space. And of course, this might be redundant. It's occupying space and time. Um, so when you think of any object, any old object you can think of, that's going to be a part of it. But if you think of any old object, you aren't necessarily committed to having thoughts about how this thing might have a specific taste or a specific smell or specific sound. Maybe you could pick some object that lacks each one of those properties. It's a certain sort of thing that no matter how you manipulate it, it just never produces a sound. Or it just has no smell whatsoever, like glass. pure glass just like doesn't have a smell no matter what. Um, at least as far as I'm aware. Maybe that's a bad example. But it seems like there's no necessary connection. It's not a conceptual feature of objects that they have secondary qualities like taste, smell, or sound, for example. So on the one hand, we it seems like objective features of objects are the primary qualities, whereas sort of tangential contingent uh, properties are their secondary qualities. So on the one hand, primary qualities are real for this reason, and secondary qualities are not. They're just a byproduct. So to sort of continue this argument, um, you might say that without the senses, secondary qualities would not arise, which seems fair enough. Most people agree with that premise. Um, Hence, without sense faculties, there are no secondary qualities, and that just almost seems derivative of the initial point that I state above. And then this is a further sort of suppressed premise that I add because it's going on in the background, but I don't think Blackburn ever actually says it. It's useful to keep clear um, that if a thing is not mind dependent, it is not objective, and if it is not objective, it is not real. So that's kind of a thought that seems to motivate this whole distinction and why secondary qualities aren't thought to be real by some. So if a thing doesn't exist independent of our minds, then it isn't objective. So take a case of maybe like a chair or something like that. You'd think that if, for some strange reason, everyone on Earth spontaneously disappeared, there would still be buildings and rooms, and in those buildings and rooms would be chairs. All these things would still exist. It doesn't seem to depend on anyone being aware of those things for them to be around. On the other hand, secondary qualities do seem to depend on someone experiencing them. If no one ever experienced, say, maybe like pain or red, the phenomenal color of red or green in this, as this PowerPoint demonstrates, no one that sort of property wouldn't exist in the world. It wouldn't be around unless somebody experienced it. So if it only exists because of minds, there's the thought that it's not a real feature of the world. It's not independent of us. It's just relative, you might say, or it's just subjective, and so therefore it's not real. So this has another variant. This distinction is motivated by another somewhat similar but distinct sort of argument, and this one is actually Cartesian. Descartes is the first to kind of identify this thought, interestingly enough. So the first sort of premise is that the senses exist to promote physical well-being. And this is a really interesting idea because it still has a lot of bearing today, and I guess that's one of the reasons why Blackburn references it. But according to our best scientific theories, it seems like sense faculties exist to promote survival of organisms, right? And while Descartes would probably say that God gave them to us, but in any case, that either with or without God, the idea remains that um, it seems like we use our senses to get around in the world, and that explains why we have senses at all. So consider two distinct sorts of smells. So smell O and smell O prime, and in each case, they could be radically different. Two entities could, I smell, I don't know, like think of any sort of thing you want, like smelling a rose or something, or maybe something that matters, like food, right? Um, so to me, the food smells sweet, and to somebody else, the food smells putrid, or vice versa. Um, and we can assume then that in this case, both of the beings in question that have these distinct smells, it's not one organism that's having the smell. Smell O refers to is brought about by a different organism than smell prime, O prime. Um, in each case, irrespective of how they experience the smell, they have um, they behave in all the same ways. They still eat it. They still avoid the same sorts of things, eat or avoid the same sorts of things. And so, if this ends up happening, they both promote survival to the same extent. Each is equally adaptive, so there's no really there's no good grounds to say that one smell is more right or better than the other, because ultimately the function of these sorts of smells is not to determine what is real. The purpose of smells is to help us survive in the world, and the same thing goes for the other sorts of um, sense faculties. So this is an interesting sort of, not quite a tangent, it's relevant. So there's the ripe fruit hypothesis that is prevalent in modern science and biology. The view that the idea is that the reason why we see a greater range of color than almost any other organism is because it allowed us to discern ripe fruit in a jungly environment. So primates were in forests with sort of uneven lighting and that sort of thing, and a lot of green. And as you as you know, people that are colorblind can't easily distinguish between green and red. And so if you're lacking that range of color perception, like most organisms are, it's hard to tell where a ripe fruit is. But if you have that range of color perception, you can effectively discern where ripe fruit is. And of course, you can see why that would be an advantage for survival. So rather than this sort of redness of the fruit being the most true variant of that fruit, the most real, um, it's just a way that things are presented to us, the way we experience something, because it helped us survive. So this sort of worry motivates the idea that, look, the things that we experience don't necessarily reflect the world at large. They could simply be the most effective way to survive. It could just so happen as a strange sort of thought experiment or possible scenario that we are radically mistaken about everything, and we're just kind of somehow this perception of the world helps us get along, but it doesn't even vaguely reflect the world as it actually stands, independent of us. And that's perfectly possible because, of course, the only reason why we have senses is to help us survive and not in order to tell us the most real version of the world, if there's such a thing. So this kind of leads to an interesting similar thought, and that is of the inverted spectrum. So the inverted spectrum is just the idea that it's perfectly possible that one person's perception of, say, red, for example, is radically different than another person's, because there's no way to tell what we're subjectively experiencing. So most people, I imagine, will say that, so this stuff is red, right? Marilyn Monroe's face in this case, and this bottom right one is red, and not any other ones. Purple, I guess. But notice that the only way that you've ever learned the word red is because you associate some personal experience with a word. And there's no way to tell if that sort of personal experience corresponds to other people's personal experience. It's just, the only thing is that each time you see whatever this is, someone says red, right? So you could just as easily imagine seeing this color and people always just said red, and then you learn that this meant red. But it just so happens it's always happened with this color. So the thought here is that other people, other organisms, other individuals could each be having a distinct sort of experience, but we just use the same labels to kind of pick out whatever is going on. So again, this would give us even more reason to doubt that there's any sort of truth to the issue. It just so happens that in each case, um, we use a common word, but that doesn't mean that that common word corresponds to a common subjective experience because we have no way to know what other people's subjective experience is. All we have to go on is the sort of overt behaviors. They say red when we say red, but they could be experiencing anything or they could be experiencing nothing at all. So that's just a kind of variant to sort of further motivate or exacerbate this sort of problem that there's not necessarily a sort of uh, fact of the matter when it comes to secondary qualities. So there's another interesting problem here, and this is a response to the primary secondary quality distinction. So maybe that's not already obvious. A response to the distinction. And this response is just that our knowledge of primary qualities seems to be just about the same from the same sources as our knowledge about secondary qualities. Um, so the only way that we know about a thing having extension or duration through time or space or a certain sort of number um, or these other sorts of things is because we experience it as well. So take the example of a Granny Smith apple, right? And strip away all of its secondary qualities. So it's green, right? So take the greenness away, and then it's sort of white on the inside, take that away, and then take away your associations with whether or not it tastes good or bad, or that it has a certain smell, or that it has a certain feel in your hand. What's left of this object? It seems like we have nothing to point to if we're trying to reduce it down to primary qualities. It would just kind of be a, a blob in space, but that just seems really strange. And again, when you consider that blob in space, how do you know about that thing? You know about it through the senses. So there doesn't seem to be as good of grounds for this distinction as originally thought. It seems like if you're going to say that any of these sorts of things are mind dependent, then all of them end up being mind dependent. Because of course, the only way we know about primary or secondary qualities is because we experience things in the world. Um, Another way to sort of confront this worry is to talk about forces, fields, and things, as Blackburn calls the section. So the idea here, just most simply stated, is that there doesn't necessarily need to be any object underlying the phenomena. So I ask, what do we need to assume in order to explain a phenomenon? So go back to the case of the Granny Smith apple and say that it's this thing that is green, it's bitter and disgusting, it's weighty, it has white flesh on the inside. And if you have this cluster of like properties and certain forces like propensities to resist pressure or a certain way that it creates flavor in your mouth or whatever, it seems like that bundle of properties is sufficient to explain the phenomena that is a Granny Smith apple. It seems like if you just put together a green spherical sort of thing that has a certain taste, you've accounted for Granny Smith apples. And you don't need to, in addition to that, also say there is a real object underlying that. So it seems like all there is to any given object is a bundle of properties. Or at least that is sufficient to explain um, our experience of what seems to be things that are like objects. So maybe on the grounds of sort of simplicity or parsimony, you'll restrict the sorts of entities that you're going to posit and just say, look, Granny Smith apples just are these half dozen properties, and adding a seventh thing that is of an object doesn't do any extra work. It doesn't help us explain what's going on. in any better than the previous 6 properties of being green, of being sour, or whatever else. So hopefully I've motivated the distinction between primary and secondary qualities, um, and then also provided some doubts as to why the distinction might be less robust than we first thought. So, as always, please ask questions if you have any, and I look forward to your papers. Thank you.